Welcome to the Lowdown. This is an AI-generated open-source news summary for general informational awareness. This product is not intended for use as official intelligence. The views expressed here are solely those of the cited authors and do not reflect the official policy or position of the Department of War, the United States Air Force, or any other U.S. government agency.
Right. So here's the bottom line up front for today's briefing. We are tracking a severe degradation of historical deterrence across three major areas of responsibility. Iran is actively utilizing calibrated military strikes to contest U.S. control around the Strait of Hormuz, while North Korea is leveraging Chinese and Russian backing to rapidly expand its nuclear production.
Yeah.
And simultaneously, Russian forces are facing critical logistical failures in Ukraine alongside a rapid collapse of their political influence in the Caucasus.
Okay, so let's unpack this for everyone listening because we really want you to see how these distinct theaters are connected. And we'll start with the most immediate kinetic situation, which is the U.S.-Iran escalation. So set the scene for us. What actually happened over the Strait of Hormuz?
Right, so the flashpoint was a U.S. Army AH-64 Apache helicopter going down near the strait. Now, the initial reporting from the Associated Press cited a collision with an Iranian drone, though they left the actual intent of that collision pretty ambiguous.
Okay.
But the assessment from the Institute for the Study of War provides a much sharper picture. They assess that an Iranian jet-powered Shahed drone intentionally downed the Apache.
Wait, intentionally? I mean, that is a massive distinction. A mid-air collision is a tragedy, sure, but an intentional ramming by an interceptor drone.
Exactly.
That's essentially a kamikaze tactic against a manned American gunship. That crosses a major red line.
It absolutely crosses the line, and it prompted a historic response, though, perhaps not in the way you might expect.
Yeah.
The two crew members in the Apache were rescued, but the U.S. Navy didn't send another helicopter or a manned vessel into that hot zone.
Right.
Instead, they deployed a Corsair unmanned surface vessel, a USV.
So an unmanned robotic boat.
Yes. And this marks the Navy's first ever USV search and rescue mission.
Wow. Just think about the evolution of warfare you were witnessing in that one single event. You have an unmanned aerial drone intentionally taking down a manned helicopter, and then an unmanned robotic boat navigating into a hostile water zone to rescue the human pilots.
Yeah, it entirely removes the risk of sending a secondary human crew into what could very well be a trap.
But the U.S. response didn't stay unmanned,
Right.
right? And it didn't stop at the rescue operation.
Far from it. The U.S. military launched direct airstrikes targeting Iranian air defense and radar installations. They specifically focused on sites around Bandar Abbas and Qeshm Island.
Okay.
And then Iran retaliated by firing missiles at bases hosting U.S. troops across the entire region. Specifically, they targeted installations in Bahrain, Kuwait, and the Muwaffaq Salti Air Base in Jordan.
Right, and the reporting indicates those incoming missiles were intercepted. But, I mean, this completely shatters the 2-month ceasefire that had been holding in the region.
It does.
So I'm trying to understand the strategic calculus here, because it sounds like a high-stakes game of chicken where both drivers are wearing blindfolds. Iran is sort of poking the bear, betting the bear is too tired to actually fight a full-scale war, while the U.S. is just trying to hold the line.
That analogy captures the mechanism perfectly. I mean, military analysts referred to this specific strategy as calibrated force.
Calibrated force.
Right. Iran specifically targets those Apache helicopters because the U.S. utilizes them to protect commercial shipping from being swarmed by Iranian fast boats and drones. By neutralizing the Apaches, Iran asserts operational control over the Strait of Hormuz.
Which is obviously a vital passageway for a massive chunk of the global oil supply.
Yeah, exactly.
But doing this while negotiations are supposedly ongoing. I mean, the core dispute is still sitting on the table. The U.S. wants Iran to surrender its highly enriched uranium, and Iran wants a release from crushing economic sanctions. And recently, Donald Trump posted that Iran is taking too long to negotiate and will, quote, pay the price. So the political temperature is already boiling. How does Iran expect to get sanctions relief by shooting down American aircraft?
Well, Iran is essentially using limited military action as an extreme form of diplomacy. They aren't trying to win a conventional war.
Right.
They're trying to make the daily cost of U.S. involvement in the region so incredibly high and so politically painful that the U.S. eventually concedes at the negotiating table just to stop the bleeding.
Interesting.
And they're coordinating this friction with their axis of resistance, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in the Red Sea. The ultimate goal is regime survival. They want to create so much noise and chaos in those shipping lanes that the international community has to look away from their nuclear enrichment facilities.
But If both sides ultimately want to avoid full-scale war, how do these direct strikes not accidentally trigger one? If you are stress testing a bridge with heavier and heavier trucks, eventually you miscalculate the load and the bridge collapses.
That is the inherent danger of calibrated force. It assumes the other side will always interpret your attacks rationally. And when you are launching ballistic missiles at air bases in Jordan, rationality is a very, very fragile safety net.
Let's follow that thread, because if Iran's primary goal is to stretch U.S. deterrence to its absolute breaking point in the Middle East, there are other global players who benefit immensely from the U.S. looking the other way.
Yes.
Which brings us to the Pacific AOR. While U.S. is busy managing this escalating crisis with Iran, China and Russia are quietly rewriting the security rules regarding North Korea.
We are seeing a profound paradigm shift on the Korean peninsula. Chinese President Xi Jinping recently made his first visit to Pyongyang since 2019.
Wow, okay.
And state media coverage of the visit heavily emphasized Xi's commitment to protecting North Korea's sovereignty and security.
And as you know, whenever we read state media reports from these kinds of summits, what is omitted is usually far more important than what is actually said.
Oh, absolutely. And the glaring omission here was any mention of denuclearization.
Really? None at all.
None. For decades, even when China was backing North Korea economically, Beijing at least paid lip service to the international consensus that the Korean peninsula should eventually be free of nuclear weapons. By dropping that language entirely during a formal state visit, Xi is implicitly legitimizing North Korea's nuclear program.
And Kim Jong-un is clearly taking that implicit blessing and sprinting with it. Emboldened by this diplomatic cover, North Korea just revealed a brand new nuclear material production plant.
Yeah.
Kim is openly claiming that Pyongyang has doubled its nuclear weapons production capacity since 2021, and he just ordered a 250% increase in missile production. I mean, that is not a country preparing for a negotiation.
No, it is a country cementing its status. Because of the diplomatic and economic backing from China and increasingly from Russia, who recently formed a formalized alliance with Pyongyang and opened new trade routes through Belarus to bypass sanctions.
Right.
North Korea's internal calculus has permanently changed. They no longer view their nuclear arsenal as a bargaining chip to be traded for economic relief. They view it as a permanent, non-negotiable security guarantee.
So if you are South Korea and you are watching your northern neighbor double its nuclear capacity with the quiet approval of Beijing and Moscow, you can't just rely on the old rule book. How are they countering this?
Well, they are looking to fundamentally upgrade their deterrence capabilities. South Korea and the U.S. are currently in deep discussions about sourcing enriched uranium fuel.
Okay, for what?
The goal is for South Korea to build a nuclear-powered attack submarine, commonly referred to as an SSN.
Let's pause on that for a second, because the distinction between a conventional diesel submarine and a nuclear-powered submarine changes the entire dynamic of naval warfare, right?
It changes the fundamental mechanics of tracking and deterrence entirely. A conventional diesel-electric submarine is quiet, but it has to surface or use a snorkel periodically to run its diesel engines and recharge its batteries.
Right, it needs air.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the moment it does that, it becomes incredibly vulnerable to detection. A nuclear-powered submarine, an SSN, generates its own power indefinitely. It can stay submerged, running at high speeds for months at a time. It really only needs to surface when the crew runs out of food.
So an SSN gives South Korea the ability to park a submarine off the coast, completely undetected, and just shadow North Korean ballistic missile submarines the moment they leave port.
Precisely.
It's a massive technological leap, but it also requires significant political momentum to get something that ambitious funded and approved.
Which South Korea currently has, interestingly enough. The ruling Democratic Party just secured a landslide victory in local and by-elections.
Oh, really?
Yes. This gives the Lee Jae-myung administration a very clear political mandate. They have the domestic capital required to push forward these aggressive defense initiatives, even if it requires navigating the very complex international regulations surrounding enriched uranium.
But stepping back and looking at the whole board here, here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. For decades, the absolute bedrock rule of global diplomacy was we must denuclearize North Korea.
Right.
It was the one thing Washington, Beijing, and Moscow could nominally agree on. But with Xi ignoring that goal and Kim literally doubling his facilities, isn't the international community essentially being forced to accept North Korea as a permanent nuclear state?
What's fascinating here is that the reality on the ground has already outpaced the diplomatic rhetoric. The great power competition between the US, China, and Russia has essentially destroyed the unified front that kept North Korea isolated.
Right.
Pyongyang realized that as long as Beijing and Moscow need a proxy to distract and drain US resources in the Pacific, North Korea will never face true isolation again.
So we are seeing superpowers act as shields for these regional actors. China shields North Korea. But what happens when the shield itself starts fracturing? Because while Russia might be gaining leverage in Asia by backing North Korea, the reporting shows that closer to home, Moscow is facing severe compounding structural failures.
Yeah, the contrast between Russia's global ambitions and its regional realities is incredibly stark. Let's look at the Russian offensive campaign in Ukraine. The Russian military command has been forced to officially ban all military cargo traffic on the M14 highway.
Okay, to understand the gravity of that, visualize the map. The M14 isn't just a road, it is the central artery of Russia's occupation. It's their main supply route connecting mainland Russia through occupied southern Ukraine all the way down to Crimea. It's basically their land bridge.
And that land bridge is now effectively under Ukrainian fire control.
Wow.
Ukrainian forces have utilized intermediate-range strikes with such precision and such frequency that the Russian military can no longer risk moving tanks, fuel, or artillery along their primary logistical route.
So what did they do?
Well, when you lose the M14, your supply chains are forced into massive, inefficient detours. You have to rely on vulnerable rail lines, or the Kerch Bridge, or naval transports, all of which, by the way, are also being targeted. It induces a profound logistical paralysis.
And that paralysis at the front line seems to be bleeding into their internal security, too. I mean, the reporting details a car bomb detonating in Balashikir, which is a suburb of Moscow.
Yeah.
This explosion killed a high-ranking Russian officer, and the location is critical. It happened right near elite Russian military facilities. So the violence isn't contained to the Ukrainian border anymore. It's penetrating the perimeter of the Russian military apparatus itself.
It is. But, the erosion of Russian power isn't just measured in military logistics or targeted assassinations. It is highly visible in their diminishing political grip over their historical sphere of influence.
Let's talk about Armenia.
Right. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's Civil Contract Party just secured a decisive victory in their parliamentary elections. They took roughly 49.8% of the vote.
Which is a massive blow to Moscow because Pashinyan has spent the last year systematically distancing Armenia from Russia. I mean, he's been pulling away from the Russian-led security bloc, the CSTO, and openly pivoting his country toward the European Union and the West.
And the Kremlin's reaction to this electoral loss was immediate, and it was aggressive. They launched a full-scale delegitimization campaign.
Of course.
Russian state media and officials immediately claimed the Armenian election was fraudulent, that the results were heavily manipulated by Western pressure, and that political opposition was suppressed.
They even threatened economic retaliation, right? Something involving fish.
Yes. Russian authorities suddenly threatened to impose restrictions on Armenian fish imports, citing abruptly discovered, quote, veterinary risks.
It's the classic deployment of a non-tariff barrier. When you want to punish a country economically, but you don't want to formally declare a trade war, you suddenly find health violations in their agricultural exports. But I want to push back on Russia's political strategy here, because it's fascinating how Russia uses the exact same playbook over and over. When they physically, losing control of the M14 highway, they are forced to adapt. But when they lose politically, like in Armenia, they immediately deploy the stolen election narrative.
Right.
They just did this during the Moldovan elections. It's a reflex. But Russia's entire geopolitical brand is built on the illusion of absolute control and stability. Doesn't crying stolen election every time a neighboring country votes to leave their orbit actually make them look incredibly weak to their own oligarchs?
It exposes a highly critical vulnerability, absolutely. The strategy relies on a domestic Russian audience accepting that the West is simply too insidious to fight at the ballot box. But to the international community and to the regional leaders watching closely, it signals that Russia has lost its most potent tool, which is gravity.
Gravity, right.
Historically, countries stayed in Russia's orbit because Moscow guaranteed their security and provided economic stability. Today, Russia cannot even secure its own supply lines on the M14 highway, let alone project security guarantees into the Caucasus.
So it's a symptom of systemic overextension. They are fighting a war in Ukraine that requires them to import basic artillery shells from North Korea while simultaneously trying to dictate the domestic politics of an increasingly independent Armenia. They just don't have the bandwidth or the leverage anymore.
Precisely. And when a traditional superpower loses its leverage, a power vacuum naturally opens up. And regional actors, whether that's Armenia seeking new alliances or Iran testing military boundaries, will aggressively move to fill that space.
So let's bring all these threads together for you listening because it is crucial to understand the direct line between these geopolitical shifts and the world you navigate every day.
Yeah.
We started this briefing talking about boundaries. In the Middle East, Iran is using targeted drone strikes against the U.S. military, not to start a war, but as extreme leverage to dictate the flow of the Strait of Hormuz.
Right. In Asia, North Korea is cementing its status as a permanent nuclear power, backed by China and Russia, forcing South Korea to pursue advanced nuclear submarines. And in Eurasia, Russia is physically losing its military supply lines in Ukraine, while politically losing its historical allies in Armenia. And the connective tissue here is the fracturing of traditional deterrence. The superpowers are either distracted, overextended, or actively enabling regional disruption. And this fundamentally rewrites the risk profile of the global economy.
Exactly. It's easy to look at a helicopter crash in the Strait of Hormuz and think of it purely as a distant military issue. But when the U.S. struggles to deter Iranian aggression, commercial shipping companies refuse to send their tankers through those waters.
Yeah, they reroute ships around the entire continent of Africa.
Right. And that adds weeks to the journey, burns millions of dollars in extra fuel, and skyrockets insurance premiums.
It creates what economists call a conflict tax. And that tax is baked into the cost of every physical good, every raw material, and every technology component moving through global supply chains. And the same applies to Asia.
Absolutely. When North Korea expands its nuclear arsenal, it forces a massive reallocation of capital in South Korea and Japan toward defense spending, pulling resources away from commercial innovation. The friction in these fault lines directly dictates the stability of the markets we all rely on.
The era of assuming a superpower will just step in and immediately stabilize a region is over. The tectonic plates are shifting, and the fault lines are where all the action is.
Which leaves us with a final, somewhat unsettling question to consider long after this briefing ends. We've spent the last century assuming that global stability is dictated top-down by the major superpowers.
Right.
But if the U.S. cannot cleanly deter Iran, and Russia cannot hold on to Armenia, who actually writes the rules of engagement for the next decade, are we entering an era where the middle powers, the regional actors, and the localized proxies actually hold more functional leverage to shape the world than the giant empires that supposedly back them? It's a fascinating reframe. The superpowers might still be taking up all the space on the map, but the middle powers are the ones quietly changing the facts on the ground. Something for you to keep in mind the next time you see a headline about a localized border dispute or a sudden shift in trade routes. The rules aren't just bending, they're being rewritten. And that concludes our operational summary. Thank you for joining us on the Lowdown. We will continue to monitor these reporting streams and provide updated analysis as the situation develops.